All right, so this applies to anything in the polygon menu. For NURBS, we don't have to lay out UVs. But with NURBS, we can't place the textures as easily as we can on a polygon. Okay? If we have a NURB sphere and we want to put a picture right here, we have to do a lot of tweaking in order to get that picture right here. On a polygon, we can just slap it there and say, there it is. Okay? So I'm going to start off very simply with a plane. Okay? And this is one of those things that's going to follow us throughout all of our lessons, because UVLayout is something super important anytime you're dealing with texturing of polygons, which most of the time we're going to be dealing with texturing of polygons. There's no NURBS that we're specifically doing in this class. So here's a polygon plane. If I were to drop a picture on here, and for this demo I'm just going to use surface shaders. So on here, I'm just going to drop in a texture. Now, UVLayout only applies, again, to stuff that's in the 2D texture stuff. Okay? Anything that's in the 3D textures are things that are procedural textures that live in like a 3D world. Okay? So if I created this crater, it doesn't matter what the UVs look like. My object could be here, and it'll get one texture, and then it rotates, it gets a different texture, or whatever. Okay? But the 2D ones are physically locked to the texture coordinates. They're physically locked to different parts of that model. So I'm just going to use, for this example, I'll use this ramp. And I hit 6 so I can see it. Come on. Okay, so what we're looking at is this plane looks like that image up here. This picture that's at the top of this, that's what that looks like. A plane by default already has the UVs laid out. Okay, the bottom left corner right here of this plane is the bottom left corner of that image. Okay, it automatically becomes defaulted, just whatever the default settings were. If I created a, oops, I already have it open. If I created a cube, I'm gonna just shuffle this off to the side, and I applied the same texture to it, you'll see that we get completely different results. Okay, we don't see the perfect black on the top and the bottom and the perfect white on the top. Okay, and even though it has the same picture, this 2D picture is not laying correctly on this guy. If I go to my window UV texture editor and we look at the plane, you can see that the plane's coordinates, these grid lines here, that's the plane, are all laid out perfectly flat. Okay, so anytime you think of UVs, try to imagine that we're taking this object and we're slicing it down one side and we're flipping it over and flattening it out. That's what we're trying to do. Okay, a plane is already a flat object. It's already laid out, so it turns out perfect. The cube, however, is not turning out perfect because, again, it's broken open and flattened out. What does a flattened out cube look like? I'm going to go to Image Dim so we can see this. That didn't really help. I'm going to also turn off my grid. There we go. And now we can see that's what that cube looks like flattened out. Okay? So even though we're getting this funky behavior, I'm just going to go here to Textures and say Ramp. There we go. And now you can see this is what it's looking like. Here's the black in these three faces, and then it's gradating to those three faces. Okay? So as far as a cube goes, I can't really get this cube to house this thing without manipulating the UVs. Okay? So if I come over here and I grab the UVs, and I swap this, and let me figure out where this corner is, and I start manipulating it, you can see that I'm adjusting where that texture is taking place. Okay? If I wanted this to be more in the dark area, I could just rotate it and bring it down, and now it's in the dark area, or whatever. Okay? There's not a whole lot of times where you're manipulating them like this right off the bat. Usually you do it other ways. So one thing I can do is I can grab one of these faces, and under the polygon menu I can say create UVs, and I can choose a different way to map this out, a different way to unfold this cube. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to planar mapping. That's typically one you'll use for something that's flat like this. And what I'm going to do is pick the direction that it's mapping to. So imagine that I have this edge of the face of the cube, I basically want to figure out which direction I want to shine that picture on there, what direction I want to project it. If you look at my projector here, and I go like this, you can see how the picture is kind of streaking across the paper like that. And as I go here, it's more straighter, okay? That's what it's going to be doing. So I want to find the best angle to project it so that the texture isn't stretched out or anything. So in this case, it's going to be the Z. I know that because the Z is right here. So I'm going to say Z, project, and now you'll see on that face that I get the dark black here and the bright white up there. And if I come over to my UV texture editor, this corner up here is that corner there, and so on. Okay, and I can manipulate it. If I go past this little box up here, it'll actually start duplicating that texture over and over again. Okay, and I can do the same thing on this side. I can grab this one, I can go a planar map, and this one will be the X direction, and you'll see how I get a nice little texture right there. Same thing here, planar map. This will be the X direction also. And then this side will be the Z direction. Okay, so now all the way around this edge, I get a nice little black to white. If I want the top to be perfectly white, I can just planar map it in the Y. I get the full color, but then I can say, okay, well, I'm going to shrink that, or scale this up, shrink it here, and just stick this in the white area. And now it's going to look like we have this box that goes from black to white. Then up here, I gotta shrink it a little bit more even. Like that. There we go. It's perfectly white, okay? So you can see how I'm manipulating the UVs to get this box to look like I want it to look. So it's perfectly black on the bottom, gradiates to white, and the top is white. So far we're good? Okay. So every surface that we have as far as polygons, we have to do that same thing. So if I had a cylinder and I assigned that same material to it, there it is, you'll see that this is the default layout. So basically what it's done, this is a better picture, is it's cut the top off and dropped that here. Cut the bottom off, drop that here. And then it took this, split it, and unfolded that thing flat-wise. Okay? So that's what we're seeing here is this is the top, this is the bottom, and that's the middle section right here that it's laying out. So again, I could manipulate this any number of ways. If I grab these faces down here, and I go to, instead of planar, I go to cylinder mapping, and I say project, now I get a bigger layout for these. I can pull this guy around, and now he is going from all the way black to all the way white. And then I can grab these guys. I'm going to go to select shell. I'm going to scale this and just stuff it up there. There we go. So now again, I have this thing going from perfectly black to perfectly white. And the bottom's not going to black, so I need to take these UVs in the bottom and go to select shell again. Flatten that guy out. And push this down there. There we go. Okay? Now, anytime I'm flattening that, what it's doing is it's taking away any kind of texture resolution that we would have. On the ramp, it doesn't matter because it's solid color. But if this is a picture of wood, and I want the bottom to look like wood, I want the sides to look like wood, and the top to look like wood, I would have to lay these out a little bit differently. Okay? So depending on what kind of texture you're using, you have to lay out your UVs in accordance to that. Now there's also an automatic mapping and a spherical mapping. I hardly ever use spherical mapping. Occasionally I'll use automatic mapping. Okay, so if I created a sphere, again, drop that same texture on there. Here's the default UVs for this. And there's even an option inside of the settings for the sphere, whether you want it to be no UVs created, so there's none, whether you want it pinched at the pole, so you can see how they all come together, or whether you want the sawtooth. Okay, so for a sphere, you actually have options. I don't think on the other ones I had options. Create UVs, normalize, normalization, there's some options there. Okay, so for the sphere, I'm going to go to the UV texture editor so we can see it, and I'm going to do automatic mapping. And you'll see with this one what it's going to do is it takes the sphere and it does planar projections. Anything that's facing pretty much towards the positive y gets this planar projection. Anything in the positive z gets this one. Anything in the positive x. And then we get these things kind of like pieced together like this. Okay? So you'll see why I don't typically use this too often, because when we get something like this, it's hard to get the texture to look like it's appropriately fitting on here. Okay? You can see how this is just kind of like funkily laid out. That's a word. Okay? But if we were to take this into a program like Mari or ZBrush, you can paint sort of inside Maya, but it's not very good. Even in Photoshop, if we were going to paint something on there, these layouts would be perfectly fine. Okay? Because in those programs, as we paint on this object right here. So I'd actually just paint right here, and it would paint this, but it's also painting this 2D image. Okay? We're going to get more into that. For the first assignment, we're not going to touch Mari or ZBrush. All right? We'll get into those as we go. All right? So eventually, we'll get into using that one. Now, there's also inside Maya, there's this new one, which is Unfold. And it's inside the UV Texture Editor, and it's just called Unfold. And we just hit Unfold. Oops, I have to grab the UVs first. There we go. Unfold. Okay? Now, there's not a huge difference right now because they were already pretty much laid out. Okay? But if I had this thing as a planar map, and I went into the edge right here, and I said polygons cut UV edges, there we go, and then I grabbed the UVs, and I said unfold, you'll see that now it unfolded these, and now I have two things laid out perfectly inside that area. Okay? Now we have to look out for certain things when we're doing any kind of texturing, which is stretching. Stretching is a big deal when we're dealing with this because if our texture starts stretching, the pixels of our texture will actually stretch and it'll look funky. So what I typically do is instead of using this ramp here, this doesn't give me any indicator as to the sizing of it. Okay? If this is stretched out like this, well, that looks good, but I don't know if that is a good fit for it. I don't know if this is evenly laid out UVs or not. So I'm going to break the connection on here, and I'm going to map a checkerboard. Okay? And now you can see on the checkerboard, right away I can tell if my texture is laid out correctly. If these are stretched out, that means that my texture is going to be stretched in that direction. Okay? So this thing either needs to be stretched out like this to make it square, or my UVs inside here need to be stretched this way to make those square. Okay? So either way, when we're dealing with textures, we want to try to find the best UV set that does not distort our stuff at all. Okay? Even on the sphere, you can see at the top of it, these look pretty square. But as we go around to the side, you can see that the textures are stretching out. Okay? It's similar to this, where we have this picture on here, it's hitting this, I don't know if you can see it too good, but on the side of this, it looks like the bands in it are kind of stretching out. You probably can't see it very good from where you're at, but it is. Maybe this. You can see that better. But it is. It's stretching it out, okay?
Believe it.
Yeah. Just believe it because I said it. Okay, so we want to find the best way to lay out the UVs to unfold these things without distorting them at all. Okay, because if we take a picture of anything, and I'll just drop a new surface shader on here, I'll map a new color, and file, folder, and Sarcona here. Source images.
Sean,
Yes, sir.
do you like using roadkill?
I do like using roadkill. I'll get to that next.
Does it work well in 2015?
It does. I haven't had any issues with it. It works pretty much the same that it did in 2014. A lot of the new stuff is going to using that unfold, but I like roadkill. So here is this wood picture that I have, and if we don't crash, there we go, and we look at this, I can see that the texture looks pretty good here, but as we get to the side of this, look at that wood texture. It was straight. If we look at the picture, this wood texture, dim image, there we go. The wood texture is straight boards, okay? So it shouldn't be twisted right here, but it is twisted because of how the UVs are laid out, okay? So I'm going to use a program called Roadkill. There you go, Dylan did load it. And all you have to do is go to Google and type in Roadkill UV. Now, I'm going to verify with Mike, there's no Mac version, right?
I think he got one because he emailed the guy, but he says it's really buggy.
Okay. So there's no Mac version, so you'd have to use the PC version.
No.
Okay. You just download it, you install it, and then down here in your Mel scripting area, you type the word Roadkill, all cap, or not all caps, but road and kill are capitalized. And then when I unwrap this, it opens it up in a separate program.
Dylan rigged his up to where he opened Maya from a bat file. So I don't know what you have to do differently with yours.
Yes, I don't know either.
He opened Maya with a bat file that automatically booted Roadkill with it.
There we go. All right, so this is Roadkill, and it's essentially, here's my model, here's the UVs, that's all we need to see. And I'm gonna go into edge selecting mode, so I go to edge mode select, and I basically just double click, and then I hit C to cut. And it automatically cuts the thing over here and lays it out in a way that best not distorts it, okay? So even if you look at the UVs for the rest of the sphere, it is distorted here. Obviously, these squares are a lot smaller than those squares, but it's getting it closer. So that I can come down here and double click and cut that. This guy here, if I look at his shape, he's kind of like a football shape because it's a tube, okay? And how do you take that tube and make it not look that? I have to cut it so I can flatten it. So then I would just go find an edge. Typically when you're finding seams for your textures, you try to find something that's on the back side. Okay, so if this is the back of the sphere, and then I cut it, and now look at the UVs on this. Everything is pretty much nice and even, okay? By just telling it I want to cut here, I want to cut here, and I want to cut here, and there we go. Think of it just like the label on your pop. If I sliced it right here and I unfolded that, that's what I'd want that to look like. It has to have a seam on it. Even my pop label has this little seam right here where the colors don't really match up, and that's fine. Okay, so there's the UVs for it. So then I would close this. I would come back in here to look at this wood, and I would say, okay, well now this wood really doesn't match. The grain is going, you know, horizontally here, vertically here, and probably horizontally on the bottom. So then I would go back into this UV texture editor, and I could just grab these, select the shell again, and then just rotate this and scoot it over. Okay. Now again, this isn't going to match up perfectly because of how we have to cut the UVs apart. But if we're going into Mari or ZBrush, that's fine. It doesn't matter because we can paint them there. Okay. If it did matter, we'd have to work out some other solution to create this texture on here. The other thing that we want to keep in mind is that now that these things are in here, I can't just grab this guy and scale him up to fit more room inside here, okay? Because now I've just stretched out his texture, and so he has a lot of texture, but there's not a lot here, okay? So anytime I lay out the UVs, I have to grab all the stuff and scale all the stuff together, okay, for that whole object. That way everything stays proportionate to each other. An example of that is we have a building front and a building side. People typically take the building front and they make it really big so you can fit a lot of texture in it. And then the side of it, they just kind of squeeze here. So you have a really high-res front, and then the side of it is just blocky and smeary pixels, okay? So the first step in anything that we're going to bring into Photoshop to texture is that we have to lay out the UVs. We have to take it into Maya and lay these things out. So in our example, we have, oops, not that. We have a cylinder, so let's pretend that this is our can, okay? Or whatever you're using. I'm going to lay out the UVs for it. In this case, I don't care about the top of this or the bottom of it. I don't see the top or the bottom because they're separate pieces. The bottom of the can in the example that I show is a piece of metal. That piece of metal doesn't have a 2D texture on it. It's just a silvery color with a little bit of bumpy or speckliness to it, okay? So there's no 2D texture. The top of it, where the cap would go, is just that plastic cap. So again, there's no 2D texture. I'm not bringing any pictures on it. I'm not putting a ramp on it. It's just flat coloring with some speckliness to it to make it look like plastic. Okay? So the only part that has the actual texture is the can part itself. All right? So I'm going to add a little bit of geometry to this just to make it look a little bit nicer. So I'm just going to add an edge loop. Not there. Holy cow. Let's double click that. Relative. There we go. So I'm just going to drop in a couple lines here. Like that. Like that. Okay. So that's our can. So now again, I have to lay out the UVs. So I just go to the Create UVs. And I go to cylindrical mapping, and I project it, and I drag this guy all the way around to the back. Okay. Now if I look at the UVs inside here, I don't know just from looking at these. Yes, obviously it fits inside there, but I don't know if it's proportional. Okay. Every texture that we bring in, well, every one that we make should be square. It should be 2048 pixels by 2048 pixels or so, something like that. So on this guy, I don't know if his texture is going to be proportionate. I could spend 6 hours in Photoshop laying this out, bring it in here, and find that my texture, my logo is like now stretched out. Okay, and I don't want that to happen. I want to do my work up front. So I'm going to assign that material to it. Okay, my surface shader that has the squares. Right away, I can tell these are a little bit squished here. Okay. So inside my UVs, I'm just going to grab the whole bunch, go to my scale tool, and I'm going to scale this until they become square. Okay? I also have to keep it within this top right quadrant. If I have anything going outside of it, it's not going to work correctly. All right? So I'm just going to shrink it down a bit. There we go, something like that. And I also don't want to get too close to the edge here. You can see how I'm right at the edge. I like to be just a hair in. Okay, so I'm just going to grab the center scaler and just scale it down a touch. All right, and that just brings it in here. So when we bring this into Photoshop, we're going to create a square document that's going to fill this area. So under here, we're going to have nothing. At the top, we're going to have nothing. Our label is going to go right in that center area. Okay. So that looks pretty good. If I needed to, I'm going to go to this checkerboard pattern. I can repeat, too much. I can repeat this more times, like 15 by 15, if I'm having a hard time deciding whether or not those squares are perfectly square. Okay, but I think it looks pretty good. It's close enough where if I needed to, I could, fudge some things around. So now I'm going to say polygons UV snapshot, and I'm going to export this. I'll say can. And here's our size. On your homework sheet that you guys did, you had this top one, which was doubling 1, 2, 4, 8, and so on. These ones up here are the resolutions that you should be picking from. Okay. If we're rendering our stuff out at 960 pixels wide by 540 pixels tall, and our texture is going to be filling a portion of that frame, we need to ensure that that texture is high resolution enough to fit that. Whew. So for this, we're going to set this to 2048. It's called can. It's a Maya if, and we're just going to say okie dokie. Okay. Now that allows us, it basically exports this picture here. No checkerboard, it just exports that wireframe so that when we go into Photoshop, we can see here's where the wireframe is, here's where I want to paint my stuff. I ignore the profile. If you have a character or you have something that's very specific, it's a lot easier to kind of read the wireframe instead of just kind of creating the texture and trying to bring it in. Okay, we can't do that. So I'm going to open up this image, and it's on the D drive, Sarcona. Where did it go? Sarcona bullet plane, 2550 work. And for some reason they put it inside images. So I'm putting in images, and there's Can. Okay, so here's my UVs. You can't see them. Okay, the higher the resolution, the harder it is to see them. So what we have to do is just bump up our visibility to see them. So I'm going to double click the layer and just add a bevel emboss to it. And then I can just take this depth, the size. Come on. Oh, that wasn't bevel emboss, sorry, stroke. There it is. Stroke, bam, there it is. All right, so now we can see the UVs, okay? So, wonderful, we can see the UVs. So now it's just a matter of going into Photoshop and creating whatever texture we want to look like, okay? For each of your objects, you should go through and figure out what stuff is actually on there. So in my example video, I use a Gillette can. So I want to go to Google Images, and I want to look up images to find a Gillette can label, and whammo, look at this, a Gillette can label. This is like wonderful, okay? I don't want you just to grab this and use it, okay? I want you to create your own, okay? So, but you can use stuff from this as far as, okay, the front of it says, I can actually just copy this, and I can paste it. And you can see why you can't use it. Look how small it is. It's super tiny. We stretch it out, it's going to look horrible. Okay, so I'm just going to resize this just so I have placeholders, essentially. I'll take that down. A bit more. There we go. Okay, and I'll call this template. And now we can go through and say, okay, over here, this says 1.7 fluid ounces. So I'm going to go to my text tool. I hit T. There it is. I'm going to make a thing, and it's going to say 1.7. And my text up here is really high. There we go. I don't want to scale it because it's going to stretch it. Fluid ounces / 160 ml. Yep. So now I can take this and then tweak it to get that to fit correctly. Okay. And this is where your typography can come in. I think I do want to scale it up vertically just a touch, just to give it some of that. Characters, styles, not character styles, character. There we go. So I'm just going to scale this up a touch. And maybe just bring those closer together like that. I'll make this bold. Oops. That's where bold is. There we go. Pick a different font, whatever. Okay, we can go through the whole process of just trying to lay out what this is supposed to look like. So I'm just going to drop this in here. There we go. I'm going to start off with the background color also, now that I just threw that in. I like the blue color, so I could always pick this blue, fill that with blue, and drop this on top so I can turn that on and off. This is what my texture is going to look like so far. So I'm always turning this off to see what that final texture looks like. Let's see, there's a gradation here, so maybe I want to add a gradation. That might be kind of neat. So I'm just going to grab my marquee tool. If you know the hotkeys, you can use the hotkeys, of course. I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to go to the gradient. And I want to, oops, this one, there we go. That's the right one, why don't you do it? Alright, I'll just drop it in manually. reverse. There we go. Come on. I gotta take this white down. It's just too bright of white. There we go. Alright, so there's my gradient there. I'll grab the text tool. I'll put a big G right here for Gillette. If I wanted to trace it, or if I wanted to find the actual font, sometimes you can actually go out and find the actual font. For this, I'm just gonna, find something that works. Okay, so essentially we're just creating what that label is going to look like. I have the G there. I'm going to put a whole bunch of stuff, exactly what we're seeing inside this label, or not exactly, but you want it to look nice. You want it to look like a completed label. Okay, we don't need to worry too much about the back, all the ingredients, all of this stuff. If all we're seeing is the front, that's all we need to really focus our attention on. Okay. So don't spend hours and hours doing all the back stuff if you're not going to see it. Some students in the past have put a mirror in their scene which shows the back of it, or they've had a can like rolled over where you would see the back. In that case, you do have to have something back there. Okay. So for this demo, I'm just going to use, I'll use this, and I'll put a little band going across. Like that. Wonderful. I'll even make it gold-ish. There we go. Wonderful. Okay. So now I'm going to save this. I make sure that all my template layers, all my wireframes are turned off. I'm going to put it inside my source images folder. And I save two things. One, I save this PSD. You always want to save your PSD because most likely you're going to have to make changes. So we'll save that. Now I'm going to save it again. Oops. As an if, okay? And the reason we save it as an if is because Mental Ray reads those better than it does TIFFs or JPEGs or anything like that. Also, a JPEG, if you're not familiar with it, will lose quality every time you save it. So if you save a JPEG and then you open it up, change something, save it again, you lose quality every single time, okay? So it's always best to save it as an if, as a Maya if, that way it works. And now if we come in here, and I assign a new material, whatever it is, what? That's funky. Oh, because I clicked use background. That's why. Surface shader. There we go. A Mia material, anything, however you're mapping it, you just map it right to that diffuse channel for the color. So now I'm going to bring my file in. Here's that can texture. And there is my texture that I just created inside of Photoshop. And now I know by looking at my UVs, let me unhide this, I know how far up or down I can go with that UV set. Okay? I wouldn't start building stuff that's way up here, because anything up here past the UVs is not going to show up inside of Maya. Okay? Only the stuff that's right here. So if you have a specific, I want to put a texture right here, and you have an edge right there going around, then it makes it a lot easier. Okay? Or you can just kind of put it there, see how it looks. If you need to move it, you can just grab the layer and move that layer wherever you need to. Okay? I also want to turn off the filter type so it doesn't blur it. So if you look, it's a pretty sharp texture here. By adding this, it kind of fuzzes the edge. And what happens is sometimes it fuzzes it too much. So typically we just take that off. Okay? Especially when we have text, our little pieces of text can get lost in this. You see it just got really, really fuzzy. Okay, so I typically just turn that off. All right, and you'll see I don't see the back of this unless I go all the way around. Okay, and I also can look and see how big this front area is. Some people will design the label and they'll take it and look how narrow that is. Okay, and they'll take they'll label stuff like this, and they will stretch it out. So the label's like that, and they have this huge label. They put it on the can, and that label wraps around the entire thing, and you can't even see the can itself. Okay, so you have to keep in mind that you're only dealing with a small area. Now, if you do your label and you're like, oh, it's in the wrong spot, it should be, at the whatever side. Well, you can just rotate it to get it in the right position. Okay, so I can just rotate this to put that in the right spot. Okay, or I can come into Photoshop and grab my layers and just move my layers where I want that texture to be. Okay. So for this assignment, this is the big thing. Okay, we've pretty much you've modeled your stuff, or you're on your way to modeling your stuff. Lay out the UVs after you do your lighting, and then you're going to start bringing your textures in. Okay, and you can use whatever resources you want to use in Google, but I don't want you just to grab something like this and drop it on yours. Okay, that's not what I want you to do. Get used to creating your own labels. You can grab stuff like if you want the Gillette logo, whatever you're doing. You'll see that there's the Gillette logo, so we can actually just grab one of these. Save page as. Usually you can copy, apparently not. Oh, it's an SVG, that's why. Copy image, take us to Photoshop, paste it, bring that down, wonderful. And I can just double click this and, oops, wrong way. Get rid of the white. G goes into this. There we go. Beautiful. Okay, I hide this. I save my stuff as an if. Yes, Maya. And then I come back in here and I find my picture and I reload it. And now I have my new texture. And oops, I forgot to put the background on, so I just go back to Photoshop, resave it out. Happens a lot that you forget something, and then I reload it. And what happens sometimes is I forget to click buttons that I think that I clicked. Oh, because I just called it can, not can texture. Yes. There we go. Okay. So you're going to add enough detail to this that it looks like an actual can. Right now it doesn't look like an actual can. It looks like a hack job of a can. All right? And you have Google Images, like I said. You have plenty of resources to look at an actual can and see the stuff that's on them. Look at all the crazy amounts of detail that's on this can. Here's foamy, regular, regular, Gillette, caution, whatever, attention. Yeah. Gillette Comfort Guide, whatever. This is a funny thing is that, I don't know, one of my shampoo bottles I noticed this morning, it says attention or something like that, and then right below it says attention again, but the E has a thing over it, and then the rest of it's the same. Right. Oh, I know, now I know what it means. Attention, okay. Yeah. Okay. So lots of detail in here. This little explosion thing, I'm assuming, is like it can explode if the can's shaking too much. Whatever. Find some cool stuff and drop it on the can and make it look like a can, okay, or a jar or whatever it is that you're doing. Okay. The rest of the textures in the scene are going to be very simple. You're going to have a sign. The sign is basically Photoshop. You got some wood and you've got some text on it or whatever. Make it personal to your specific one. In mine, I'm using wood, and I have, the best a man can get, or whatever Gillette's slogan is. But if you're doing something like girly, then you could have, I think I was talking to Martha about this, you could have like a piece of cloth or a piece of fabric or something dainty and have words on it, like a wedding invitation or something. This is I don't think it's going to pull anything up. Doily wedding. I don't know if that's something, but something like that. You know, you could have this picture of a doily and your words right on that, or something girly like that. Okay.
Something girly.
Yeah. Okay. But in order to do that, we have to be able to take the UVs out. Okay. We'll get more into UVs as we go. This is the first step. You have to understand this kind of stuff. If you don't understand it, you have to do it 50 times. Sit with me. We'll go over it 50 times. Okay. The next assignment that we do, I look at the thing. I'm going to